Let me first give you an example of why perception is actually a psychological process. Because you might think, well, how is that psychology? It's just, if you have visual perception, you have a bunch of light that enters your eyeball, and then there's a bunch of biological activity that analyzes that light, and then you just perceive whatever happens to be in front of you. That's not related to psychology at all. And in fact, engineers would love for that to be true, because if that were the case, then they could actually build autonomous artificial systems to perceive in just the same ways as humans do. Just to give you some idea of why that's not the case at all, I want you to take a look at this video here. So, why is that interesting? Well, it shows you very clearly that the amount of light that some object like the square reflects is not just going to give an accurate perception of what that actually should look like, because the brain takes into account cues about shades, about what the relative surrounding is, about whether there's some sort of light being blocked, and so forth. So that's interesting because it suggests that perception is actually dependent on the context in which something is being shown to you. So how do we make sense of information we get from our senses in general? Is something we talk about in the section about perception. We get a lot of information in it at any given point in time. Visual information, auditory information, tactile information. Out of that whole cluster of stuff coming in, how is it that we actually have some coherent perception of the world around us? How do we make sense of it? That has several sub-questions to it. So for example, when we perceive objects and faces, how is it that we manage to distinguish between objects and where one object ends and the next object begins? And the perception of faces, your friends' faces, do we perceive those similar to how we perceive objects? Or is there something special about that? Or how does that work? How do we perceive organization in general? Meaning, again, there's a clutter of information in front of you. I'm sitting at a desk right now with a bunch of books and a bunch of pens and a tape roller and a glass case. And somehow, even though that information all comes in and actually falls on your retina in the back of your eye and becomes two-dimensional, we somehow make sense of it and see all these different objects. So how does that work? Depth perception is related to that. How do we get a three-dimensional perception of the world when we just have two eyeballs that are basically almost in the same place? And then what is the influence of having knowledge when we see and hear things? If you are, for example, somebody who works with x-rays, how do you see that x-ray differently than a person who does not have any sort of knowledge about x-rays? So these are some of the questions that we will touch on in the section about perception.